Hello, and welcome back for another scary story for October 2012. Tonight's story actually concerns a relative of mine, someone who most people believed was a witch. I call the story My Aunt the Witch. My grandmother Mildred had a great aunt whose name was Molly. Grandmother grew up in Townley, Alabama back in the 30s and 40s, and Molly did not live very far down the road from her. Molly was grandmother's great aunt, which would make her my great aunt, which also would probably make her older than America itself. But what Molly was most known for in Townley was being the most orneriest, meanest, most evil woman that the whole town had ever known. She wore these long black dresses with shawls, and her long black hair was always tied up real tight in a nice little bun. She stayed away from people, hiding in her house, skulking around. When people tried to cross her path, they received nothing but evilness from her. She was so mean to people. She was not a people person at all. My grandmother used to go with her father out to Molly's house when her father would take care of Molly's crops and livestock, because Molly was well on in her years and was very ill, so she couldn't handle her property management there. So while grandmother's father would bustle around the property taking care of the animals and the crops, grandmother would go out in the street and play ball with the neighboring children. Molly could not stand the sound of children's laughter. That's how mean she was. And whenever it got too loud, she would come bursting out of the house and yell at them, "You little fools! Quiet down! You're going to wake the dead!" All the kids would shrink back, except for my grandmother. Fearless as she was, she would stand up to Molly. "We're just going to keep right on playing so you can see how happy people can be and how much fun people can have when they're nice." Molly would glare at her. She couldn't stand my grandmother. She would glare at her and say, "Mildred Lee Carroll, one of these days you're going to burst hell wide open, you little hellion." Of course, my grandmother would stand her ground and reply, "Well, Molly, if hell were to burst wide open, you'd be the first one they take." Molly would storm back into the house and slam the door behind her. All the neighbors and their children stayed away from Molly. They were always afraid of her and believed that she practiced black magic in her house. Why else would she stay cooped up in there? My grandmother once said that she even went around Molly's house to look and see if she could find one of those big, great black pots that witches used to stir their potions in, or maybe some bats hanging from the ceiling, or one of those pointy hats. But she didn't find anything. But she was convinced, as mean as Molly was, that she must be a witch. Let me tell you how mean Molly was. Once there were two little girls that lived down the street from her, named Kathy and Cindy. Beautiful little blue-eyed girls. Kathy was only 7 and Cindy was 5. Their mom sent them down to Molly's house. Out of the kindness of her heart, she had picked some flowers out of their garden and decided to send them to Molly. So the little girls went down the path to Molly's house and knocked on her front door, holding up the bouquet of flowers in their hands. Molly flung open the door and looked out at them and glared. Little Kathy spoke up as she held the flowers up. Miss Molly, our mommy thought you might like these flowers. They might make you happy." Before they could say another word, with one swoop, Molly snatched the flowers out of both of their hands. She lifted them up to her face and shoved the petals into her mouth, chewed the petals off the stems, and spit them out on the porch. Blech! She then threw the bare stems down at the feet of the little girls, and turning into her house, she slammed the door in their faces, just leaving them there. How evil can you be? Molly also had a neighbor named Old Man Kilmer who lived just down the path from her. Both Molly and Kilmer had large properties. Both had just dozens of acres, and their properties were separated by a beautiful stream that flowed almost right on their property line. Now, Molly and Old Man Kilmer had a feud going on about whose property that stream actually flowed through. Mr. Kilmer believed it was his and always tried to use it for water to fetch for his horses. But Molly was insistent that that was her property and that he should stay away. Old Man Kilmer didn't listen, and one day he sent his servants out with buckets to fill them up with water for the horses and for the troughs. Before long, the servants came running back to the property screaming with their buckets empty, yelling at the top of their lungs. Old Man Kilmer stopped them and calmed them down. Both men, shivering and shaking, stammered out their tale of how they'd reached the stream, and before they could fill their buckets, a crazy, scary-looking old woman burst from the bushes with long hair sticking out and long black fingernails. With eyes like a snake, she hissed at them and screeched until they turned and ran for their lives. Old Man Kilmer believed that Molly was just up to her tricks, so he decided to go take a look for himself. But when he reached the stream, to his horror, he found that the whole entire stream was dried up, just like that. How could that possibly humanly happen? Well, Old Man Kilmer had no doubts that, indeed, Molly was a witch. From that day forward, he stayed clear of her property and sought out his water elsewhere. But I must tell you, the most popular story about Molly was the story of Albert. Albert was a servant who worked for Mr. Martin. Mr. Martin was a local grocery man who owned the grocery store there in Townley. And Albert would go around on the horse-drawn wagon and deliver groceries to people who weren't able to pick them up at the store. Mr. Martin was very kind and very generous. When he heard that Molly had gotten deathly ill, he decided to actually send some free groceries and supplies out to her. He pulled Albert aside one day and explained what he needed for Albert to go out to Molly's property and deliver groceries. Albert, having heard all the terrifying stories of Molly, shrank back. "No, Mr. Martin, please don't send me out there, please." But Mr. Martin soothed him and explained to him how important it was. Albert loved Mr. Martin. He was the best boss ever, so he decided to obey Mr. Martin and go on out. So after loading the wagon, he took off on his journey on the horse-drawn wagon, and rode them all the way out to Molly's property. When he entered the property, chills automatically went down his spine as he approached her house. It was the loneliest looking place he'd ever seen. Complete silence, not even birds chirping. No one could be seen about. Albert didn't want to stay very long at Molly's property for reasons that are obvious, so as quickly as he could, he pulled the wagon around the back of Molly's house. As he got off the wagon, he glanced up at the house and thought he saw movement in the window of the upstairs floor. Was it the curtains moving? Was someone looking out? Albert didn't want to stick around and find out, so he unloaded the groceries as quickly as he could. Emptying out the wagon, he left everything there on Molly's back stoop, hopped back in the wagon, and took off as fast as he could. He got down the path and entered the main road, and after putting some distance between himself and Molly's land, Albert felt a lot of relief. So much so that he started humming a tune to himself as he rode along the path back to town. Eventually, as he continued to hum, he heard what sounded like an echo behind him. In fact, it sounded like someone behind him was humming right along with him. Was it the wind? Albert turned and looked back at the road behind him. And there he saw her, Molly, following right behind the wagon. She wasn't walking. She wasn't running. She was floating. According to Albert, she was floating 4 feet off the ground, at least. She kept perfect pace right behind his wagon, floating along, her hands behind her back. Her grin spread across her face as she glared at him. Fear seized Albert once again as he took the reins of the horses and galloped as fast as he could. He looked back and saw that Molly was keeping pace with him perfectly. The faster he sped up, the faster Molly got behind him. Albert got the horses up to full speed, and still Molly stayed right behind him. Eventually, Albert realized that there was a stream approaching, and there was a bridge that ran over the stream. Things started to click in Albert's mind. Wasn't there an old legend that witches can't cross water? Or was it ghosts? He didn't care. All he knew was he had to get away. So he galloped the horses over the bridge, their hooves thundering on the wooden planks, until he made it all the way across. He started to feel a little bit of relief and looked back. Just as he thought, Molly was not back there on the road anymore. But as he looked down into the wagon, to his horror, he saw the reason she wasn't on the road was she was now sitting in the wagon right behind him. She glared up at him, and her teeth pointed out sharp and long. Her eyes were like that of a snake, and she screeched out at him. Albert, seized by fear, suddenly went airborne as he leaped off the seat of the wagon and landed on the nearest horse in front of the wagon. He grabbed hold of the horse's mane and held on tight, crying and screaming, "Lord, Lord, please save me! Lord, save me!" The horses knew their way to town on their own, and to Albert's relief, the town was not very far away. After a few minutes, the horses entered the town at full speed, galloping down the road. Albert, still seized with fear, continued to scream, yelling out for help. Neighbors started opening their doors and looking out of their houses as they watched the wagon speed down the road. The horses found their way to Mr. Martin's store and stopped outside the front entrance. Mr. Martin, hearing the commotion, ran outside and looked and saw Albert clinging to the back of the horse, crying and screaming. Mr. Martin approached him and grabbed him and shook him. "What's wrong with you, man? Stop it!" Albert opened his eyes and pleaded with him. "Mr. Martin, please, please get out of that wagon, please!" Mr. Martin turned his head and looked back at the wagon. Then he looked back at Albert. "Albert, who are you talking about? Get who out of the wagon? There's no one there." Albert eased his head around and looked back to see that Mr. Martin was telling the truth. The wagon was completely empty. Neighbors who had seen the wagon thundering through the town had gathered around to see what was going on, and each one told the same story. When the wagon sped by, all they saw was Albert clinging to the back of the horse. The wagon was indeed completely empty. But Albert insisted that he saw that crazy witch in the back of the wagon. The sheriff, knowing that Molly was very ill and not up to playing pranks like this, decided he better go out to her property and check on what was going on. So the sheriff hopped on his horse and made the long, lonely trek out to Molly's land. When he reached her house, he hopped off the horse and went up on the front porch and knocked on the door. The door slowly opened, and one of Molly's relatives looked out at the sheriff. He cleared his throat. "Is Molly here? May I see her?" The relative appeared sort of stunned at his request, but stepping back, she eased the door the rest of the way open and allowed him to enter. When the sheriff entered the house, he noticed that the front room was filled with relatives sitting around talking. Molly was nowhere to be seen, but knowing she was on her deathbed very ill, the sheriff decided to go back to the bedroom to see if she was there. Going back to the bedroom, he peered in through the door. Sure enough, Molly was there, lying on the bed, with the covers pulled all the way up over her head. She wasn't moving a muscle. She'd been dead all morning long. I hope you enjoyed this, and happy Halloween.